Hello friends and welcome back to Generation Pixel. My name's Stuart and yes, I do collect mostly for the PlayStation 2 at the moment, and yes, I do play mostly on a PlayStation 5. But if you want to take a trip down memory lane with me, we'll have a look at where my collection habit started, just after these. And how could I not start with Hungry Horace, the very first game that I ever owned and also a very early video game mascot. Now Horace is not much of a looker, but to ZX Spectrum fans, well, he's definitely the man. And being of course a mascot, he had more than one game. He had a trilogy of games, and the only other game I have of Horace is Horace Goes Skiing, an absolute fan favourite of a game and one where we see sort of Frogger elements, as well of course as the titular skiing part. Now I don't have a lot of sports titles for any system, but of course there have got to be one or two examples, and as you can see from Frank Bruno's boxing, which is nothing more than a Punch-Out clone, despite it being released before Punch-Out was released on the NES. We can see the sports titles such as Street Cred Boxing and Steve Davis's Snooker tended to have more realistic images when it came to their box art. Checkered Flag is another fine example of an early Spectrum game, and yes, it's a pole position clone, but a very good one and one I recommend you playing if you get the chance to. Being a very British microcomputer, of course darts was going to make its way onto the system. And there are plenty of options when it comes to darts, but 180 is hands down the best one you can play, and so much so I would recommend you playing it today as well. And last up in the sports and games section of the collection, we have chess. Now chess of course has been put on just about every system that's ever been created, and that even includes the ZX81, which could run a 1K version of chess. Now of course you could put arcade racers and driving simulators into the sports and games category, but for me I think driving games deserve their own special spot, and the first one in this category for me is Stunt Bike Simulator. And the last in this category is Super Stuntman, and the eagle-eyed of you will have noticed that this is an early Codemasters game, and certainly a piece of video game history. Of course, because these games were made back in the 80s, we were still interested in space and science fiction, because we still had a keen interest to explore that final frontier. So many of the video games, they were no different. They were heavily inspired by space travel and of course science fiction. Now there were an absolute plethora of games like this, and most of them of course spawning from the wonderful Space Invaders, the game that started just about it all. But if there was one that stood head and shoulders above the rest for me, well that was Silversoft's Orbiter, which was little more than a Defender clone, but at the time, back then in 1983, Defender for me was the absolute bee's knees that no other game could touch at the time. And it wasn't just science fiction. Back in those days, pure high fantasy was another big seller at the time. Don't get me wrong, it still sells well today, but the box art in the 80s still sort of held on to that wonderful 50s, 60s and 70s high fantasy style. Then of course there's just the plain bizarre games like Riddler's Den with the strange elephant, and Prison Riot with these really psyched up prisoners escaping onto the roof, and Corruption, where you've got this alien dropping goo on you from above while you're trying to climb the ladder. And last but not least, A Day in the Life, a game dedicated to a day in the life of Sir Clive Sinclair, of course, as many of you will know, as the father of the ZX Spectrum and all Sinclair products. The next selection of games are the MAD games, the MAD, Masteronic Added Dimension, which were the $1.99 range, which actually meant we paid £1.99 for them. And this was such a boon back in the 80s, because although £1.99 was still a lot of money for a kid, it was within acceptable pocket money parameters. It was something that we could get our hands on. And of course, if you were feeling a bit more flush, you could just get the plain old Masteronic titles and pay just a little bit more money to get the games when they came out originally, even if that meant spending your money in something that was essentially just product placement, like the video game advertisement for KP Skips, and that was Clumsy Collins Action Biker. Terrible game, but like most of them, it was the artwork that drew us in anyway. And now for a selection of games that I just truly adore, starting with Raid Over Moscow, a multi-level game where you have to save the world from a Russian nuclear assault. How topical, right? Then Beachhead, another game from US Gold that takes place during World War II. You have to get your troop carrier across the ocean and onto the beach and then defeat the enemy's citadel. Classic 80s gameplay that is also multi-level. The Way of the Exploding Fist. Now this game is the granddaddy, or one of the granddaddies of all fighting games. And for me, playing this on the ZX Spectrum, I had to use 9 keys on the keyboard to be able to execute all the moves required to defeat your opponent, and requires 100 times more technical skill than most of the other fighters that emerged at that time. And although I don't have much time for beat 'em ups and brawlers these days, games like Subway Vigilante transport me back to a time when I did love these games. And being able to clear out wave after wave of enemies was just one of the simple joys that you had back in the 80s, well, at least me anyway. And to finish this section, one of the creme de la cremes, and that's none other than Jetpack from Ultimate Play the Game. Now you probably know them as Rare and have played this game on the Rare Replay for the Xbox One, but when I tell you that that game that you play on that modern system, it plays just like the one back in the ZX Spectrum back in 1983, I would like to think that your mind is blown just a little bit, because this was one of the best games at the time and still is to this day. Now of course I've got Horizons, the software starter pack, which is basically the first ever tech demo I ever used. It might even be the first ever tech demo ever. It had a selection of games on it like Through the Wall, which was a breakthrough or Arkanoid clone, and other programs that showed you exactly what your ZX Spectrum could do. And hand in hand with that you had the ZX Spectrum Plus User's Guide, which was exactly what it said on the tin. It was a manual on a cassette tape. For the penultimate section of my collection, I thought we'd look at something that I still collect today for modern systems, and that of course is licensed games. Now we're suckers, I know, buying into licensed games, but when you get games like Thundercats, especially back in the 80s, or if you're an 80s kid at all, you have got no option but to play it regardless of how bad it is. Now the Flintstones, that is a terrible game. That is a game that will put shivers down the spine of anyone who's played it on any system. Ghostbusters, however, was one that impressed me because it wasn't just an action game, it was more of a Ghostbusters franchise simulator. Now yes, of course there's action elements to the game, but the whole point of the game is to make enough money that you can carry it forward to the next game, and that was something that really intrigued me back in the day, even in my youth. And of course Aliens, we still buy and play Aliens games today. Now this one's not too bad, and to be fair, there's been quite a number of Alien games over the decades that play quite well. Perhaps game developers don't think this particular license is one that you should mess with. Now this particular Turtles game is the same as the one on the NES, except it's with clunky Spectrum controls and with colour clash Spectrum graphics, so let me tell you, if you think the NES version of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is difficult, you wait until you give it a try on a ZX Spectrum. Cobra, of course, was the Sylvester Stallone action movie from back in the 80s, and although it plays nothing like the story of the film itself, it is a fantastic action game, and it's one of those games that proves the ZX Spectrum is superior to the Commodore 64. Play those two games back to back on those two systems and you will see the Speccy definitely rules. And finally, Batman the movie in this section, and this was the last ever game I bought for the ZX Spectrum. It is a wonderful game, but I was just getting to the end of my 8-bit life, I would imagine, at the time. Graphics from that era just weren't cutting it for me anymore, and arcade games were just getting better and better. So this game of course has some sentimental value, as it signalled the end of a particular era in my gaming life, but at least it was a good one to finish on. And the last thing I've got to show you is the Magnificent 7, and that's a multi-pack, and multi-packs were quite a thing back in the day. Rather than just buying one game individually, eventually you would get compilations where you would get several games, such like this one. And of course you might get games that you've already got, like Stallone's Cobra for example, but if you didn't have Head Over Heels or Whizball or The Great Escape, then it was here for you in a big box compilation. So thank you for taking the time to take a stroll down memory lane with me and have a look at my ZX Spectrum collection. If you want to talk about any of these games, of course drop that into the comments, because the interaction between you and me is what makes YouTube special. Thank you again for watching, and until next time, as always, cheerio!